Hello, I am the Linkzilla. I would like, if I may, to take you on a journey. It began nearly 20 years ago, and it began, as these things often do, with a small boy. A young, naive, and unassuming sort, whose destiny was to carry the fate of not just his, but several worlds upon his shoulders. That scrawny little puke, no less than 10 years old, was about to become arguably one of the most important men in the entire frickin' multiverse. Oh yeah, this is his story. Well, actually my story. I was that boy. And this game is a very loose retelling of the events that changed my life and set me on the path to becoming the man I am today. This is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And before you ask, the reason why the franchise is named after her is because she is actually to blame for screwing everything up. The story is of her monumental failure, and it is legendary. Though I personally don't think it was a good idea to name the game after a woodwind instrument, but then again, your developers had a problem of focusing too much on the MacGuffins now, didn't they? So how did this adventure begin? Why, with a prophetic vision, of course. One that featured the girl of my dreams and the man of my nightmares. Truth be told, had I not met either, then my life would probably be less complicated. Boring, but less complicated. But that's hardly more than wishful thinking at this point. The three of us were bound together by destiny, set on a journey that would determine the fate of Hyrule and shake the foundation of several realities. This was undoubtedly one of the most important days of my life. I admit that I was still a bit groggy when I opened my eyes. I still believed that I was in the dream until I realized that the fairy hovering over me was in fact real. In Kokiran culture, fairies are designated to be the guardians of the Kokiri, and they're known to bring good luck. And more often than not, they're a lifelong companion and best friend. Never having had a fairy come to me and be my partner, I was always considered an outsider, looked down upon by most of the other Kokiri. So needless to say, I couldn't quite fathom my feelings when Navi came to me that day. A mixture of confusion and happiness and excitement came to me. I saw this as a sign that my luck was finally going to turn around, but we didn't have much time to get formally introduced, as Navi was quite insistent that we get going. I didn't quite know what to make of her at first, but I can confidently conclude that she was new to being a guardian herself. But it was undoubtedly the start of a great friendship. She seemed to fill this need that I had in my life. Granted, her tiny voice could get somewhat grating, but I'd go on to experience worse. And if I could be quite frank, I think that the hate that she gets is inexcusably over-exaggerated. This was my best friend in the forest, Surya. While most of the other Kokiri in the forest treated me with amicable neutrality, Surya was the only one who actively sought out my company. She was my only companion in the woods for the longest time. The only person who never judged me for not having a fairy, never treated me like I was an outsider. Apart from the Deku Tree, she was the only one who made me feel welcomed for as long as I could remember. It's ironic. Looking back on this, I remember drawing it, imagining that one day I'd be some great hero fighting off monstrous dragons or the like. I had no idea just how eerily prophetic this carving became in my later years. Truth be told, knowing what I would soon be capable of doing, I often looked back on Mido with desires to revenge myself against him. For as long as I could remember, he always fancied himself as the leader of the forest community, a sentiment that no one else shared nor asked him to take. And throughout my entire time in the forest, he was always one to bully me for not having a fairy. He was always one of those snobbish better-than-thou types. I'd like to look back on him with contempt, but unfortunately, he will have a role to play before this tale is done, one that inspires me to think better of him from time to time. I should take this moment to point out that occasionally there are things this game gets wrong in the portrayal of these events. For the one thing, I didn't need to have a sword and shield equipped to see the Deku Tree. I went in there with naught but a slingshot and some Deku Seeds. Secondly, I didn't buy the Deku Shield at the Kokiri shop, mainly because there was no Kokiri shop. When you live in an isolated community of forest children completely uncontacted by the outside world, what would you need to engage in trade and commerce for? We were kids. In a lot of ways, she's not wrong. The Deku Tree is a lot like a father to all the Kokiri, and much like Saria, before Navi came along, he was one of the few in the woods who was always looking out for me. I was quite anxious to talk to him about the dream I had. Yes, just because I am an adult now does not mean I am not still immature. For years, we all lived under the notion that there was some kind of external force that would immediately strike us dead if we were to step over the boundary line. It made for sure that no one was bold enough to try it. Some, I gather, even suspected that the Deku Tree was lording it over us like a threat to deter us from leaving. It would later turn out that it was all just a well-meaning scare tactic. The Deku Tree believed, as many others in Hyrule did, that being so small and vulnerable, the Kokiri would easily be picked off by bandits or monsters out in the world. They were much safer in the forested haven. But there would come a time where they would have no choice but to leave anyway. But we didn't know back then. We didn't know. I don't exactly know how to describe it. The first time I ever held a sword, I felt oddly complete. Like a piece of me that had been missing all my life had finally been found. I took to it like it was a natural part of me. I wouldn't find out why until, ironically, years later. But like Saria said, there was only one Kokiri sword in the forest, and it wasn't hidden back here anymore. Mido had it. He was under the false impression that finding the sword meant he deserved to be the boss of the Kokiri. He had the sword on him that day when the Deku Tree called for me. Anyways, keep the sword's design in mind. It becomes a point of contention later on. And thus, my main source of income was discovered. This is Fado. She is a trickster. She might seem like an unassuming girl, but there's something rather sinister behind that impish grin of hers. I just didn't find out what until years later. I still find it creepy that they were keeping that close a tab on me all this time. When you're strapped for cash, just rob your enemy. Like I mentioned before, I didn't buy the Kokiri shield. The one that I had was the only one in existence. Mainly because mine was actually carved from the wood of the Deku Tree himself, and contained the last bit of his magic within it. I always felt proud to have it. With its Kokiri symbol emblazoned on the front, I saw it as a reminder of who I was and where I was from. I got it as one of the final gifts from the Deku Tree when he... Well, I might as well let you see for yourself. The Deku Tree was the closest thing I had to a father back in those days. He was always there for me to confide in whenever I was feeling alone, and he was ready to chastise Mido for being mean to me. He was the guardian protector of all the Kokiri, but Saria always said that he gave me special preference and attention. It further went on to explain why Mido hated me so much. But regardless, it was always considered a special honor when the Deku Tree summoned you to come to see him. That's when you knew the situation was serious. As I mentioned before, the game gets a lot of events wrong. I'll explain as we go further, but to be frank, the Deku Tree didn't have time to explain all this to me until it was all over, and I never went inside. I didn't need to at that point. Either way, I doubt that a living and healthy magical tree would be hollowed out, much less having a map and compass stashed inside of it. The situation was a lot more immediate than depicted here. Mido actually followed me to the meeting, curious as to what was so important. As I mentioned earlier, I already had a slingshot. It was one of the few things I had on me when I went into this situation. I actually made it myself just a few days prior, really impressing Saria. I had used it to pull some pranks on Mido. Don't worry, I was just retaliating against some previous slights, and he totally deserved it. So needless to say, I had plenty of practice with it at that point. I tend to be a fast learner, and I was already a crack shot. I didn't find out why that was until later. Full disclosure here, the Deku Tree was not a dungeon. Even the earliest sections of my adventure, none of the areas you will see here counted as a dungeon in my mind. To my knowledge, only one technically is one. There were no puzzles to solve, at least not for the first part, no treasures to obtain, as of yet, and no magical teleporters at the end of the line, at least not here. As for Goma herself, the queen was actually outside of the Deku Tree the entire time, trying to burrow her way inside of him, with a swarm of larvae around. Mido made his presence known when, upon seeing the creature, he ran away screaming at the top of his lungs, dropping the Kokiri sword on the way out. Fortunately for me, after pinning Goma with my slingshot, I managed to recover the sword for myself. Picking it up brought out an unknown strength that I never knew I had, and Goma was destroyed. The Deku Tree told me everything I needed to know, and upon giving me the Kokiri's emerald, his last set of orders was that I carve a shield from him before he died. In a sense, it made me feel better about the whole thing, almost like I had a piece of him to carry with me on my quest. Watching him die was one of the worst moments of my young life. First sadness, and then rage. I didn't care all that much, nor did I understand his explanation of the Triforce or this princess. But what I did care about now was that the man who did this to him, the man from the desert dressed in black armor, was out there somewhere. I wanted to avenge the Deku Tree's death, and if going to the castle meant finding this man and stopping him, so be it. Needless to say, being the last one to see the Deku Tree alive wasn't easy. The game here makes it seem like everyone was just jumping to conclusions based on what Mido had told them. They were a bit more forceful than that. It wasn't said in so many words, but I was effectively banished from the forest that day, especially because everyone expected to see me dead the moment I crossed over the threshold. Not that I cared all that much. With his dying words, the Deku Tree gave me permission to leave and set me on my journey. I was still hot with rage and ready to take on the world. Maybe it was a good thing that I still had at least one friend to keep me level-headed. I never cared much for the depiction set in this scene. Oh, it played out similarly enough, but I remember ending this conversation with a hug. Saria was one of my few friends in this world, and one who hadn't turned their back on me because of what happened to the Deku Tree. The Ocarina she made for me was a genuine, heartfelt gift, and it was easily one of my most treasured possessions to remind me of home. What happened to it was a tragic loss, but we'll get to that. Either way, I had taken my first step out into the big bad world. A young, naive child, angry, sad, and confused, and all I could think about was getting my revenge. I left my forest home and set out for the unknown. I didn't know what to expect from the land of Hyrule outside our borders. Little did I know exactly what I was getting into. I was about to change the world, for better or worse.